Abd al-Rahman II ushered in an era of prosperity. Some can argue this is what happens when there's some tranquility to the land and you have some strong leadership. Tax revenue increased, almost double what his father had brought in, and thus the standing army was well paid and expanded. Luxuries began to flow in from across the known world. The emir began an impressive series of public works. The man was pretty prodigious. Naval facilities were created for a new fleet of ships. The city of Murcia was founded as an administrative center in the southeast. The great mosque of Cordoba was expanded, and new mosques were created in the cities of Jaén and Seville. Aqueducts and bridges, including the one into Cordoba, were repaired and strengthened. And to top it off, the emir even had city walls, a treasury, and a mint constructed. Rahman also expanded the bureaucracy of his government. It was a period of budding maturity for Al-Andalus that would grow and serve it well down the line. For example, he created a position known as a hajib, and I love this word. The rough translation from Arabic originally meant the doorkeeper, but for the purposes of his rule it was going to mean prime minister, a person who could help him to intercede with the people. He also created secretaries for various functions known as khatibs and advisors known as wazirs. This was getting to be a pretty sophisticated government, and this prosperity was getting noted by his neighbors. Embassies were beginning to be created with many of the major powers, and not just with the Franks, as I had previously mentioned, but also with North Africa, the Byzantine Empire, and surprisingly enough, with the Abbasids, who had by now moved the capital of the Caliphate to Baghdad. So think about this for a second. Despite political differences, you had the opening of this highway of knowledge that was moving new ideas and inventions back and forth along an area that stretched from Al-Andalus all the way to India. And here's the thing, Abd al-Rahman II was also a patron of the sciences and literature. He picked up on the idea from the Abbasids of converting and preserving ancient Greek texts. He would also fund studies into the development of architecture, applied mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. And this was something that the Islamic world as a whole was doing. There's a reason why when you look up into the night sky, that many of the larger stars that you see have Arabic names. Now, how far did all this get? One of his more daring scientists, a Abbas ibn Firnas, who was a Renaissance man before there was even a Renaissance. This man was a physician, a chemist, an engineer, a musician, and an inventor. And one day, he came up with an interesting concept. He walked to the top of the tallest structure that he could find. Some sources say this was the Tower of Toledo. And then strapped on a pair of wings and attempted to prove that human flight was possible. And this in the 9th century, so eat your heart out, Leonardo. When it came to religion, Rahman II had a mixed report card. On one end, he decreed that both the Jewish and Christian communities were to be considered people of the book, meaning that they were to be tolerated as long as they paid their taxes and worshipped in their own designated areas. This was more religious freedom than they had previously experienced, and many non-Muslims flourished as a result, some even rising to decent ranks in the government. But it goes without saying that this was not going to be exactly perfect. There was going to be discontent, especially amongst the Mozarabs, or the Christians that were living under Muslim rule. In Cordoba, a priest named Eulogius would fan the flames of discontent, encouraging the Christians to proclaim their faith in front of Muslims instead of in just their areas of worship. The somewhat draconian punishment for this act, which was considered blasphemy or apostasy, was death. And so while there was religious freedom, it had its caveats, and if you broke these caveats, the punishment was quite severe. In all, Eulogius got 48 people to come forward to martyr themselves for their religious convictions. But before this spiraled out of control into a bloodbath, Rahman held a convocation, a church council in Seville, to hopefully resolve the issue. The leaders of this council, who were Christian, prohibited their flocks from engaging in this act of defiance, and so this movement finally came to a stop. Eulogius was arrested, but to the credit of the state's policies, he was eventually released and traveled to Pamplona. But when he came back in 859 and attempted to reinstate his teachings, he was arrested again. Sometimes people just have to learn it the hard way. But this time he wasn't going to get so lucky. He was eventually executed. This was overall, however, a period of relative stability for Islamic Spain, and I say relative because there was always rebellion simmering under the kettle lid somewhere. There were militant neighbors all looking for an opportunity to attack, not to mention random events like the Vikings showing up. But like a giant arch, you need a strong keystone in the middle to keep the whole structure standing. You need strong leadership, and that's exactly what Al-Andalus had at this point. Now let me ask you this. What happens when you remove that strong leadership from the equation? Abd al-Rahman II died suddenly in 852 and was succeeded by his son, Muhammad I. Muhammad was a devoted, sharp-minded, and capable leader who just happened to be ruler at the wrong time. The sudden succession caused shockwaves throughout Al-Andalus. Uprisings, revolts, rebellions which were kept in check by his father started up all over the land. In particular, the Muwallads, the people who had converted to Islam, this included the Christians as well as the Berbers, felt increasingly disaffected. They felt that the aristocracy had become too elite, and that they were nothing more than second-class citizens. A rookie emir was all they needed to bring their grievances to bear, and this on a military level. The Muwallads of Toledo broke off from the Emirate, going so far as to ask help from the Christians of Asturias, now under the rule of Ordoño I, who actually came to their aid. Muhammad had to divert a bulk of his army to put this down. He defeated the combined Toledan and Asturian force at the Battle of Guazalete in 855, but it took him a few more years to take the city by siege. And Toledo wasn't going to be alone. Mérida did the exact same thing. Al-Andalus was beginning to spiral into a period of intense instability. On many occasions, the disgruntled Muslims would look to their Christian neighbors for help, who were just looking for an opportunity to add gasoline to the flames. Poor Muhammad. Despite his governing skills, he didn't get much of a break. Even the Vikings came back for another raid in 859. This was beginning to look like the perfect storm, but wait, it was only going to get worse. In the year 850, Umar ibn Hafsun was born in the city of Malaga. He was considered a rambunctious person with a short level of patience that would lead him to rage quickly. His short fuse led him to kill one of his neighbors, and his early life was marked as being a desperado, part of a band of thieves who preyed on the locals and hid up in the mountains. This man had all the makings of a Netflix series. When it became too precarious to continue his trade, he fled from Spain and took up residence in Morocco, where he lived the life of a tailor until the heat had settled down. When he returned to Al-Andalus, he took up his old profession of being a bandit, and he was really good at it. He rose up the ranks and soon became the leader of his outfit. When his forces began to grow, he took the abandoned ruins of the old castle Bobastro in southern Spain and rebuilt it into a fortress and thus a base of operations. And from here, he began to expand further. But along the way, he became the focus of a movement. The disaffected Muwallad, who resented the emir for his poor treatment and heavy taxation, began to rally to him. His numbers continued to increase, to the point where he could even challenge the armies of the emir in direct combat. Now, he wasn't always successful. He was defeated in 882 and again in 891. But despite these setbacks, he had a lot of support, and he was beginning to look like a contender for the throne. All that was needed at this point was a very poor rival. When Muhammad I died in 886, he was eventually succeeded by his son Abd Allah, who, let's just say, he wasn't exactly the first choice for succession. Now, as I'd mentioned before, Muhammad I really wasn't that bad of a leader. He was just dealt a really bad hand. Abd Allah had to continue to hold this bad hand, but unlike his father, he was a terrible ruler. Where his father had a sharp mind with a military instinct for command, Abd Allah was introverted to the point of being reclusive. He was very religious and not much of an out-of-box thinker. He also seemed to have the emotional lability of a 7-year-old, prone to severe tantrums, and many of these outbursts were directed at his own family. Al-Andalus, which had been jolted by internal dissent, now began to disintegrate under a massive new wave of revolt. In all, there were 30 major and minor uprisings, and the cost of putting these down bankrupted the economy, which began to fail. Then, the Emirate began to fragment. Seville, which was the second largest city, broke off in the year 889 and became an independent state. Umar ibn Hafsun, the previously mentioned bandit who had turned political rival and conquistador, marched an army to the gates of Cordoba and was just barely defeated in the year 891. Even the Christians in the north, who sensed their opponent's misfortune, began to advance south. They reclaimed portions of the Duero River Valley, which would lay the foundation for the Kingdom of Leon, and they took the upper portions of the Ebro River Valley, which would one day become the Kingdom of Castile. Now, while all of this was going on, Abd Allah was busy plotting the soon-to-be successful murders of his two brothers who had irritated him, and then he decided to convince one of his sons to kill his other son, but for good measure he had them both executed. The only one left that was slated to come to power after this purge was Abd Allah's grandson, who had displeased him the least, and somehow had managed to make it to the top of the list for succession. But was this a blessing, or was this a curse? You had a failing economy, an extremely discontent populace, massive uprisings, aggressive neighbors that were carving up your land like a turkey, and a popular rival for the throne. This was a bit of a bad time for anybody to come to power. Most would have bet that this was the end of Al-Andalus and the lineage of the Umayyad. Hugh Kennedy, in his book Muslim Spain and Portugal, puts this all into perspective. Quote, "Basically, this was a government by pillage, and the Umayyad army was no more than a marauding band that was living off the country. Its main objective was not to uphold the authority of the state, but simply to feed itself." End quote. Most would-be rulers would have probably walked away from the opportunity, quote-unquote, to lead this mess, and maybe some of them would have probably even surrendered the position altogether. But the grandson of Abd Allah was an extremely remarkable and talented man named Abd al-Rahman III, and as we're about to see, Rahman and Al-Andalus, for that matter, were down, but by no means were they out. They had not yet begun to fight. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that ends Part 4. Join us next time in the continuing story of Al-Andalus, when the Emirate becomes a caliphate and then experiences its best of times and its worst of times. By the way, if you dig the music, it's from a variety of sources. It's from Paul Avgernos and RoundSkyMusic.com, Andy from Shut Up and Play Music Tutorials on YouTube, and from Purple Planet Music. The links will be in the description of the podcast below, and these people have my gratitude. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, I urge you to return the favor and spread word about the podcast. Let someone who you think would benefit from history know about this show. Now please also take that extra few moments to rate and review on iTunes. Don't leave this off for somebody else. If you liked what you were listening to, also consider contributing to Flashpoint History on Patreon. Again, the link will be in the description of the podcast below. You can also follow along with Flashpoint History on Facebook and on Twitter. So until the next episode, thank you for listening.